So, like you said, my name's Tony Farnsworth, and I'm giving a talk on how to pass a front-end developer code review or interview, with me. Talk a little bit about my experiences working at the company that I do and what I've seen interviewing a lot of individuals here in the Austin, Houston, Dallas, Texas area for developer positions. So, about myself, I grew up in Detroit. Graduate from Brigham Young University, Idaho, tiny place about an hour and a half outside of West Yellowstone. Probably most of you might not have heard of it. And I work for a company called USAA. We're based out of San Antonio, and in terms of IT size, we're pretty good size. We've got about 2,000 plus IT employees. And in the last couple years, we've been rated #1 by Computer World for the last 3 years for #1 place to work in IT. So we have a really rich IT culture, and in the front-end development space, it's very new and is really evolving fast. So these are the two things that I'm not going to talk about. Hopefully the slide deck's going to be available afterwards. These are two articles by a front-end engineer named Nicholas Zakis, who used to work for Yahoo. Has some really good tips. So if you want some specific tips and all the nitty-gritty details that I don't have time to go over, please go through these. One of them talks about surviving an interview with him. The other one talks about what every good front-end engineer should know. So a story about a struggle. So working at USA, for the past 3 years, I've been heavily involved in, I started by sitting in on interviews and then finally helping to conduct. And then this last winter and the beginning of this year, I've been really in charge of and helping with all the interviewing of front-end engineers at USAA. And so what I noticed is that there were a lot of things that were lacking in basic foundational skill sets in some individuals that I'm going to hopefully impart some of that knowledge onto you guys to help you to really be ready to be interviewed and ready for it to be that industry top talent that everybody's looking for. So there's a couple aspects to this. One is I'm going to talk about the skills that I specifically look for and we've looked for as a company. They're important. We're going to get back down to the basics, which is what I talked about is kind of missing sometimes. We need to focus on. And then I'm going to talk about what it means to be an enterprise coder, and because we're really looking for those types of individuals. So the list. You guys have probably seen on any rec sheet on a site where it says, here's the specific things we want you to have experience in. Here's mine. There's a lot of stuff out here. I'm not going to go over all these, but if there's something on here that you've never seen before, I'd recommend writing it down and doing some research into it and knowing a little bit more about it. Now back to basics. So when I ask people to get back to basics, or I say that the basics are missing, really what it comes down to is understanding the basic concepts as a front-end engineer well enough to teach them. It's one thing to have applicable knowledge, that you've coded something before, but when you can break it down so that a 12-year-old can understand what you're talking about, your understanding of it really increases, and that's really what we're looking for from those top talent that can break it down to the simplest pieces. So in my observations, there's a couple areas that I think are missing when it comes to the basics. One is good front-end developers need to know CSS, they need to know JavaScript, and they need to know HTML. Oftentimes in interviewing, we find an individual has a very drastic lacking knowledge of one of these three. They've been a JavaScript developer, they came from a big, heavy server-side background, and they do really rich application-based JavaScript, but they struggle with CSS because it's a different language, and they're worried about, they don't really want to learn it. They're too worried about they'll become a designer by learning CSS. All of these languages are tightly mirrored together, and to be a good front-end engineer, you need to know how they all work together and be able to implement them well all together. Next, performance. So performance is something that's missed a lot of times. We ask individuals how different pieces of code impact the page load of the website that they're on, and what the pros and cons of different performance techniques are. Understanding and knowing your code impact, whether that code be JavaScript, whether that code be CSS, or even the HTML you generate, what it has on the impact of the page load is very important, because with the mobile phones that are out there, and even cellular networks, people connecting their laptops through all parts of the world, slower connections, whatever it might be, all comes down to our control over delivering a good experience. We need to know how to do that. There's two links that I have provided here. One is from Yahoo, a tool called YSlow. The other one's PageSpeed. If you've never heard of these before, go check them out. They're very important tools out there that can give you a high-level understanding and figure out where you can learn more in how to improve the performance of your pages. And next, don't be tied to a framework. A lot of individuals say they know JavaScript, but maybe it's just jQuery, or they're really good at web page design, but it's because they're awesome at Bootstrap. It's good that you know a framework, whether it be CSS or jQuery, any framework, but don't be tied directly to it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So now I'm going to show you some specific examples in basics that are missed, some questions that I've asked that often just get kind of overlooked and people aren't 100% sure on. We'll start with CSS. So looking up at the screen here, got a paragraph tag with some text inside of it, and I've got 3 different selectors that are defining the color of it. And the question is, what color is that text going to be? Red. Okay. Now, at this end here of why is very, very important. It's not often that people miss this question, but what they miss is when we dive into some more details around this and why it's red. If I were to take that my ID with the color of red and put it to the bottom of that declaration, it'd still be red. And understanding that, earlier we had a talk on CSS where they talked about priority and they talked with selectors. And this is what it comes back down to. The basics of CSS is about the cascade. That's what the C in CSS stands for. Understanding that well has to do with many of your CSS bugs. So know the why of it. Next, CSS box model. I know it's really simple, but you do not believe how many people, when we ask them about some specific box model, maybe specifically about a div or specifically about a span tag, their default properties and how that relates to the box model, understanding that really well. How's IE's box model different? Or which versions of IE is a box model different? Understanding and knowing that's very important. The why is very key. With JavaScript, we have 2 variables declared here. Which one makes it public? Anyone? The first one. Why? No var. Absolutely. So, and I want to expand this a little bit beyond that point. Variable scope is very, very important. Collisions of code. We're going to talk a little bit later about enterprise coding. When you have lots and lots of lines of code in JavaScript or multiple libraries and you have collisions, understanding that basic principle is all about that, the context and scope. Very important to understand. Next item, pure JavaScript. I put JavaScript does not equal jQuery. jQuery is a JavaScript framework, a library, but it's not what it is. These are some of the things that are missed. We ask people to do some DOM manipulation, meaning take an element that's on the page, a paragraph, a div tag. With pure JavaScript, grab it, change the color, change the size, get some points, put it back in. It's all very important. So don't anchor your skills to a specific framework. Understand how that framework works and what the $sign does. Now, be an enterprise coder. Really important. If you've ever heard of a selfish coder before, I always say don't be a selfish coder. It's an individual who doesn't think outside of their sphere, and sometimes their code is problematic when we have to integrate with other individuals. USA is a big company, big IT. We're all about enterprise. So it's important that your code is reusable, configurable, testable, well documented. One way to prove to a company that you know this is through GitHub. Open source a project on GitHub and show that you're looking at a larger community. Get people to contribute to it and add and take away from it. That's exactly what we do in an enterprise environment, and that's what an enterprise coder is about working with other individuals with their piece of code and making it better than it is. So big picture, get back to basics, learn the whys, and be an enterprise coder. Just some books I recommend reading and my contact information. I appreciate your guys' time, and USA is hiring for anyone who's interested. I created a URL for it, and thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Great. Okay. So I am Annie Epstein, and I am so excited to be talking to you guys about accessibility. Woo! Energy after lunch, right? Right? Okay, so I first got interested in some accessibility stuff back when I lived in the DC area, where accessibility is pretty much all you hear about because of all the 508 government stuff. So it's something that I've been kind of thinking about ever since. But specifically what I want to talk to you guys about is, what is accessibility? Why accessibility? You know, maybe you're not government, maybe you don't care so much. And okay, kind of how do you do it, right? So those are the three things that I'm going to talk to you all about. So first of all, remember, point one, what is accessibility? Accessibility is not wheelchairs. You know, it's not, I don't know, blind people. Accessibility really is about universal access. So it's not so much focusing on, you know, disabled, blah, blah, blah. It's really about, can everybody, everywhere use your stuff, understand your stuff. So it's about inclusiveness, not necessarily pointing out where people might be lacking a little bit. So universality, so that's what it's all about, and that's something to keep in mind throughout thinking about accessibility. So it tends to be, you're already seeing accessibility, even if you don't do it in your web work, in some common places like televisions. You see here, even if you just happen to be deaf, or maybe you have the sound turned off on your TV, you too can hear Dwight's little witty comments. So you get included in that, even if you don't happen to have that particular sense available to you. Another big one you're going to encounter is ramps. They're called curb cuts, so you'll see those all over the place, actually, and they're going to be helpful, of course, if you are in a wheelchair or if you have a stroller. Interestingly, this picture came up because lots and lots of people on some little chat area were complaining about this particular curb cut because it's not quite lined up with the markings on the road. So it shows how important these things are to people now, that just this little thing makes people stumble when they walk in this area, and that's super frustrating, and that shows how important, you know, getting some of this stuff right is, actually. So, why should I care? Of course, if you're doing government-related stuff, you should care because you have to care. But if you're not necessarily working on government stuff right now, there are other reasons why you might want to care. One of them is it's going to enrich some of the stuff you do. There's going to be more in there. You know, sort of like, you know, Doctor Who box, there's more in there than it looks like outside. So I don't know if that was the right choice, but the idea is your site will be more searchable. It's going to have more ways of accessing it. For instance, like a chat transcript log is one way of making something that's audio or video accessible, and it's going to be really useful if you just don't want to watch that video right there. You can scan through the chat, so it tends to be more useful for a lot of people, and a lot of accessibility features do tend to have that sort of thing. Another thing is that there are a lot of people who actually have some sort of accessibility. This isn't exactly right. It's actually about 20%, but I really like the picture. That's 20%. So, you know, it's not an accessible picture. So if you had a red-green color blindness, you wouldn't actually be able to see this picture. I'm sorry, but it's 20%. So 80% of people can see it, but 20% of people who have some kind of issue in some ways is a lot of people, actually. There are probably some number of people in this room right now, actually, who are colorblind, and, for instance, and there could be other sorts of things that you don't even think about, but there are a lot who aren't necessarily going to have all of their facilities available to view your site. And if you're assuming all of them are going to be there, you're not going to be correct in that. That's a pretty significant portion of the population. And a third reason is altruism. See the dog there? That's a blind dog. The other dog's helping him. Pretty good, right? So it's really of value and really, really helpful to people to put in some of these accessibility features. There's a guy that I used to know who was an actual rocket scientist, super smart, just like all of you guys. He was a great cook. He was blind from birth. He was an excellent skier. He couldn't read the newspaper. Can't drive. When he got his first girlfriend, he had to go ask the clerk at Walgreens to help him buy a condom. Awkward. So, as much as technology means to all of you guys, and I see a lot of you are looking at your computers and things right now, to someone like that, technology and along with that, accessibility means access to the world. It means ability to be productive in society, to do a job, to have privacy, and to be able to do things by yourself. As much as technology does mean to some of you all, to someone like that, technology and accessible technology helps you be a complete person in today's society, and that is an important thing and something worth considering when you make your decisions about how much should I consider accessibility in your site. Okay, but how? Right? That's point 3. So, important to know with accessibility stuff is there are tools out there to help you with accessibility, but a lot of accessibility, only about 30% actually of all accessible type things can be found with tools. For a lot of it, you've got to think. You've got to think about what is there and what you need to be able to communicate. So here's just a little example slide of stuff. And when I first started thinking about accessibility, I would have gone through and tagged this with, for instance, alt equals swirly thing, and alt equals A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, blah, blah, blah. Alt equals, maybe I put all of the data in the graph and talk about how it's going from green to red. But really, on this slide, I'm showing different types of information. So the actual information here is, okay, swirly thing, non-information. Not really important. I would just say alt equals nothing for that. Nobody needs to know there's a swirly thing. Nobody needs to know the color of the paint in this room. Since the information here is perhaps the different types of data or ways of presenting information, you might say alt equals text, or like letters or text. And this might be alt equals graphical. So the information here isn't the actual stuff in there, and actually just putting all that out might even distract from what you're trying to say here. So you want to concentrate on what you're trying to communicate, not so much what is literally there. So text will do a lot for you. Just going to text straight out is accessible in a lot of ways, so that is something, when in doubt, make something text. And just quickly want to touch on these 3 things. They're related: accessibility, usability, and backwards compatibility. A lot of times these 3 things get conflated, but they're actually 3 different but related issues. Accessibility is what we've been talking about. Usability is just going to be how easy something is to use, which actually, to make something properly accessible is something you might have to consider for people. So you should think about that, because, for instance, hearing a page through a single word stream like you would with a screen reader is going to be very different from the usability experience of being able to scan through a page. And a lot of people also confuse backwards compatibility as well, but you may or may not be using an old browser when you're dealing with something like a screen reader. Lastly, I want to say use experts if this is something that is critical to your site, because that's a dog, you're an expert, right? He's sniffing stuff. No human can do that, right? So accessibility, getting it exactly right is difficult, and just like really good design or CSS that we know, something like getting accessibility exactly right is an art of its own. So if this is a critical thing for you, I would recommend doing that. So thanks.
All right, hello. My name is William Moner. And my talk is about higher education for interactive design or interaction design, and my interest is in preparing the designer of the 21st century. So that's what the talk will be about. You're welcome to follow me on Twitter. You can also check out my website if you want to find out a little bit more about me. After this talk, I'd like to invite you, anyway, to join in the open spaces to talk about this topic a little bit further. And hopefully there's enough that we discussed in here that will lead to some really good conversations in the open spaces. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Texas State University, Grayson Lawrence and Sam Capilla, for their assistance in putting together this proposal. We had proposed it as a 50-minute talk, and we got cut to 10. So please come over and at least say hello to Grayson and Sam. They're really amazing people, and I thank them for their help. Okay, so what do I teach? Well, I teach web design and interactive media primarily, and I started teaching at the Art Institutes back in 2005. I've since moved on to teach in the communication design department in Texas State University, and I teach digital media in the radio, television, film department at the University of Texas at Austin. So my interests are wide-ranging, and I'm very interested in HTML and the web platform, as it were. But I'm also interested in the audience side, very much so. The devices that people use, the things that people use technology for, the things that require you to think about accessibility, the things that require people to consider what it means to design for people. And if you had attended Kyle Simpson's talk before lunch, he really touched on a lot of the things that I think are very important to this field. So in trying to think about how we prepare the designer of the 21st century, we have to think about what the web means to people, not what the web means to us, okay? Just yesterday, 2 days ago, Tim Berners-Lee, there was an interview with him that was published on ZDNet, and he talked about how the web, because it is so highly programmable now, is a computer in its own right. And to a lot of people, that might be very confusing, particularly if you are somebody who's just entering this field for the first time. So our concern with undergraduates is they come to us when they're roughly 18 to 22 years old, and they're trying to figure out how they fit within this greater scope of this industry. And it's not entirely clear where somebody might fit within this industry, because there are a lot of different roles that they can take. Now, what we do know, and what we are very good at talking about in this industry, are the tools that we use. We're good at talking about HTML. We're good at talking about CSS, JavaScript. We understand, or we want to understand, object-oriented programming as best as possible. We talk in obscure languages about Pythons and PHP and Ruby on Rails and all of these things that can be mystifying initially to people who are just looking at this as technology, not unlike, perhaps, how they view a television and interactive menus on a television from the audience side. So when they make that jump from I'm a receptive, or I'm receiving this, I'm a passive user, I can open up a Tumblr or open up a Twitter account and start to think about how they can design and craft for the web, that's a huge leap. And in our discussion beforehand with Casey over in the open spaces, we talked about how background is bullshit. Well, these kids don't even have background yet. So my question, and my question is for the industry, and for the people who are employers in this industry, is, well, why is that background bullshit? And how can we make a better background for people so that they walk into this industry and are able to answer the questions that Tony asked, and they're able to address the issues that Ann asked about accessibility. So some of the other things that need to be considered, the business of the web, e-commerce, search engine optimization, marketing, analytics. So these are really difficult issues for people to grasp if they've never worked in a business or worked in an industry, or they might have worked at McDonald's, or they might have worked at some small company as they were growing up, but they didn't really have an opportunity to understand what an enterprise level system might look like. Content management systems, these are entirely vexing to students. Social media and marketing, they use social media, but they're just as accustomed to being marketed to, and they don't necessarily know how to craft their own online persona. So I want to suggest that perhaps we do need to embrace the liberal arts in technology, quite a bit actually. I think we do need to know our history. I think we need to know sociology, psychology, political science, how systems work, how human systems work. This is a human system. The web is not a stack of technologies. We're here to understand those technologies so that we can craft for those technologies, but it's not that. The web, like Soylent Green, is made of people, right? So those people use different languages. They use Spanish. They use Portuguese. They use Hindi. They use a number of Eastern Asian languages, Mandarin, Cantonese. The web is not just US-centric, and it's really hard to think beyond our borders in Texas because, man, who wants to leave Austin whenever there is abundant tacos, beer, and what's the third that forms the triumvirate? Coffee. Barbecue. But, who has time for barbecue when you're gorging yourself on breakfast tacos and, hammering out code? Literature, composition, cultural studies. These are all very important domains, and I think that if we start to get students to think about the broader spectrum of the web rather than the narrow spectrum of the web, I think this can help. And, some of these things emerge from traditional media. I'm a media scholar, so I talk about film art and media studies and those sorts of things. But also human-computer interaction is very important. User experience, user interface, information architecture, how to craft better navigation for people so they can move through a web experience in an easier way. Ergonomics, physical interface, accessibility. So as you can see, if you're looking at this from a technologist perspective, you get a very complex issue that you think you can solve with programming code. When we look at it from an educational standpoint, we have to sort out all of these things for our students and help them to understand it in a bigger framework. And that's where I think part of what we need is some help from the industry to know exactly what it is that you're looking for out of people. At Texas State, I think we do a great job in dealing with design, the outward-facing web, the surface, imaging, graphics, color theory, layout, grid design, mobile devices, the affordances, teaching people what an accelerometer is, which can be complicated as all get out for somebody who doesn't understand physics. What geolocation means for somebody who hasn't gone outside of Texas and understands like what maybe Austin is really great for, or just comes from a rural area and doesn't know what Austin is about at all. Geolocation can be really complex for people to understand once they start to make that jump to design for it. Also typography, and thank God for better typography on the web. I want to ask for a round of applause, but I only have 10 minutes. But even more, Mike Taylor's talking about HTML5 for TV in the session coming up. And I think motion graphics, 2D skills, 3D skills, audio editing, video editing, and thinking about the web as a medium is going to be very, very important into the future. Not to mention law and economics, contract law, media law, copyrights and patents. Don't you wish you had those things whenever you were undergrads and understood them before you went into the workplace, rather than signing your first contract and signing away your maybe your stock options or something like that in your first startup. And digital cultures. I think they need to understand what online communities actually mean and not just conversing with each other, communities of practice and things like that. So in my challenges to you, And what I'd like to think about in the open space is what courses would you have taken more seriously when you were in school? Or what would you have taken in school? What skills or subject would help you in your daily work to navigate this worldwide crazy web? And ultimately, I know I missed a lot of things in my talk. I only had 10 minutes, but what are we missing? And what do you need from our graduates? And with that, I thank you for your time. Please join us over in the open spaces.